3 lots lay in someone's hand before any of them were cast. That is where the story begins, not with the thunder, not with the palace on the mountain, not with the long war that had just ended and left the sky swept clean of its former rulers, but with 3 small objects held in a closed fist over a world that was still settling into its new silence. The Titans had been driven down into Tartarus. The fighting was over, and now the 3 brothers who had won stood at the edge of the quieted world, and there was a question that could not be answered by strength alone, a question about how the world would be divided and who would take which part of it for his own. The lots had not yet been drawn. Nothing had been decided. The sky above them and the sea spread at the horizon, and the dark that lay beneath the earth were all, for a moment, equally available to any of the 3. That moment, before the hand opened, before the pieces fell, before anything was fixed, is the one worth dwelling on. It had the specific quality of a pause that cannot last. The world was waiting for a shape it did not yet have, and the 3 brothers were the ones who were going to give it that shape, not through argument or agreement or decree, but through the operation of chance itself. The tradition that preserves this moment is one of the oldest continuous strands in Greek mythological literature. Homer's Iliad, composed in the 8th or 7th century BCE, in the form we now have it, carries in its 15th book a scene in which Poseidon, challenged by the messenger goddess Iris on behalf of Zeus, explains with considerable feeling why he does not simply follow Zeus's commands as if Zeus were his sovereign and he were a subject. What Poseidon recounts in that scene is the lot drawing itself. 3 brothers, 3 domains, a division made not by Zeus's decree, not by any council of gods, but by chance, the result of which each brother was bound to honor. Poseidon's point in the Iliad is that Zeus had no special authority to order him about, because Zeus's rule over the sky was itself the result of a random draw and not an inheritance, not a conquest, not a gift. The 3 were equal. The lots determined everything. That is the story as Homer's tradition held it, and it is old enough that by the time the Iliad was being performed in the 8th century BCE, it had already become the accepted account of how the cosmos got its shape. What the lots looked like, the tradition does not say in precise detail. They were drawn from a helmet, shaken together inside the bronze vessel, until the order in which they fell out carried the force of fate. The method itself was familiar in the ancient Greek world. Lots were cast for military assignments, for the distribution of land, for civic offices in the democracy Athens would later develop. To use lots was to remove the decision from human or divine will and place it in the hands of something that could not be accused of favoritism. Each brother reaching into the helmet or watching as the pieces tumbled out was accepting a result that no one of them had engineered. This was, in its way, the most elegant possible resolution to a problem that could otherwise have produced another war, as long and catastrophic as the one that had just ended. The silence before the lots fell would have had a particular quality. 3 figures at the edge of a newly quieted world, holding or being held by the anticipation of a result that would be irrevocable the moment it was known. There is something in that pause worth noticing. Not tension exactly, not the tension of people who might fight over the outcome, but the specific weight of a moment whose meaning has not yet been fixed. The sky was still undivided. The sea was still undivided. The deep country beneath the earth was still undivided. Everything that would happen afterward, every storm, every shipwreck, every soul arriving at the far shore of the underworld was, in that particular instant, still contingent. And then the lots were drawn. Zeus received the sky. It is hard to say, looking at the account from the distance of more than 2,000 years, whether anyone would have been surprised. Zeus had been the one to lead the war against the Titans. Zeus had been the one to free the Cyclopes from Tartarus and gain their gratitude and their weapons. Zeus had been, by most accounts in the tradition, the youngest of the three brothers, and the one whose particular destiny had been shaped by the specific circumstances of his birth and upbringing in a way that the tradition would spend considerable time elaborating. But the lot drawing, as Homer's tradition records it, was not a ceremony designed to confirm what everyone already knew. It was a genuine division by genuine chance. And when Zeus drew the sky, he drew the portion of the world that would place him above everything else, not because seniority or strength required it, but because that is how the lots fell. The sky, in the ancient Greek understanding, was not merely the air, it was the domain of the highest and most encompassing power in the visible world. It held the sun in its path, the moon in its course, the stars in their fixed and wandering arrangements. It held the weather, the rain that made the fields produce, the thunder that caused animals and people to stop and pay attention, the lightning that arrived with the speed of intention from an enormous height. To receive the sky was to receive the position from which everything below could be seen, and from which anything below could, in principle, be affected. The ruler of the sky was, by the logic of the cosmos's own architecture, naturally above everything else, not because anyone declared it so, but because up is above down, and the sky is above the earth, and Zeus found himself standing in the position that the structure of the world itself made the highest. There is a particular image in this worth following slowly. Zeus standing in the light of the uppermost air, above the clouds, above the weather that he would come to govern, the horizon stretching in every direction below him, the earth small and entire in the distance beneath, the sky vast and open above and around. The clouds in that image are far below. They are part of his domain, but they are not where he stands. He stands above even those. The quality of the light at that altitude, as anyone who has been above the weather in any sense knows, is entirely different from the light below it. Clearer, harder edged, everything more itself and less dissolved in atmosphere. That is the domain the lot assigned to Zeus. That is the light in which the king of the Olympians came to be understood. What the sky gave Zeus beyond position was visibility. A god of the sky is seen. Lightning is not invisible. Thunder is not quiet. Rain, when it comes, is felt by everything it falls on. The domain of the sky is of all the three great domains the lots produced, the one that imposes itself most regularly and most visibly on the world below. A storm is Zeus making himself known. Sunshine is the sky in its benevolent aspect, the specific quality of a day in the ancient Greek world, whether it brought good sailing weather or the kind of clouds that kept ships in harbor, was the sky god's domain and the sky god's responsibility. The lot that fell to Zeus was in that sense the most continuously present one. Poseidon was called on when the sea was relevant. Hades was at work when the living became the dead. But the sky was always there, above every field and city and road and temple in the entire Greek world, from morning to night and through the night again. Poseidon received the sea. The sea in the ancient Greek world was not a background or a setting. It was an enormous, permanently present fact. Greece is a country whose mainland is deeply indented by water, whose populated islands were entirely surrounded by it, whose trade and communication and military capacity were all fundamentally dependent on what the sea decided to do on any given day. A god who controlled the sea controlled, in a very practical sense, the safety of every ship that left any harbor in the Greek world, the availability of every fish that any coastal community needed to eat, the structural integrity of any coastline that faced a storm. To receive the sea as one's domain was to receive sovereignty over something that the ancient Greek world thought about, worried about, gave offerings to, and named in prayers with extraordinary frequency. Poseidon is called Enosigaios in the tradition, earth shaker. The epithet appears in Homer and is among the most consistent elements of his characterization across the ancient sources. The power to shake the earth was understood as connected to his dominion over the sea, the deep geological relationship between the movement of the ocean floor and the trembling of the ground above, was, in the tradition, concentrated in a single divine figure who could strike the ground with his trident and cause the whole earth to answer. Earthquakes, in the ancient Greek understanding, were Poseidon's work. The sea trembling before a storm and the ground shaking beneath a city were different expressions of the same sovereign power. Poseidon standing at the edge of a sea that stretched to every horizon, the water moving in long, slow swells that felt as though they had no beginning and no end. That is the domain the lot assigned him, a domain that touched every coastline the Greek world possessed. The tradition in the Iliad is careful about one thing above all. Poseidon, speaking to Iris in that 15th book, is explicit. The lot drawing was fair, the result was binding, and the brothers are equals across the three domains they received. His objection in the Iliad is not that Zeus received the sky unfairly, but that Zeus seems to be treating the common earth as though it falls under his exclusive authority, which the terms of the original agreement explicitly prevented. The broad earth was common ground. It had been declared so. No brother owned it alone. And Poseidon, standing in his own sovereign domain, was not going to accept instruction about what he could and could not do on territory that belonged to all three of them equally. That detail, the common ground, is one of the genuinely interesting structural features of the division, as Homer preserves it. The lots divided sky, sea, and underworld. They left the earth itself outside the division entirely. The earth was not assigned. The earth was declared common to all three brothers, and could not be claimed by any one of them without transgressing the agreement that had given the entire arrangement its stability. This was not a failure of the lot drawing to be thorough. It was, in a sense, the tradition's acknowledgement that the living world, the world where cities were built, where crops were grown, where the humans whose worship sustained the gods actually went about their daily existence, was too important, too central, too continuously contested, and needed by all three brothers to be assigned to any one of them. Hades received the underworld. Of the three lots, his was the one that took its recipient the furthest from the world. The other two would continue to inhabit. The underworld, in the Greek tradition, was not a small or simple place. It was an entire geography, a landscape of rivers, fields, gates, and enormous extent, through which the souls of the dead moved in continuous, unhurried procession. The rivers had names. The regions had names. The topography of the place was detailed and specific enough that poets and mythographers and philosophers spent centuries elaborating it, adding features and revising boundaries, and introducing or removing regions as different aspects of the tradition were developed by different thinkers and communities. But all of that geography was underground. All of it was, by the nature of the lot Hades received, cut off from wind and weather and the sound of living things. The particular quality of the underworld in the Greek tradition is its removal from everything that defines the world above. There is no sky in the underworld. There is no weather. The sun does not cross its ceiling. Wind does not move through it. The sounds of animals, of cities, of the sea, none of these penetrate into the place where Hades rules. It is the most enclosed of the three domains, the most entirely defined by the absence of what the other two domains are filled with. Zeus's sky is open in every direction. Poseidon's sea is in constant motion, stirred by wind and current and the passage of ships across its surface. Hades' realm is still. The souls moving through it are by nearly all accounts in the tradition, moving without the urgency or the appetites or the projects that kept them moving when they were alive. They are going where they go. They have all the time there is, because time in the underworld does not run out. The tradition has a peculiarity worth noting here. Hades, who received one of the three great domains by lot, is almost universally not counted among the 12 Olympians. He is not absent from the tradition. He is one of its most important figures. But the 12 gods who form the divine court on Olympus, the Dodecatheoi, as the Greeks named them, the group whose altar in the Athenian agora was established in the 6th century BCE as one of the earliest archaeological attestations of their collective identity. Hades is not among those 12 in most ancient accounts. His domain is elsewhere. His residence is elsewhere. The lot assigned him a place that is, by its nature, not the mountain where the other gods assemble. He rules a kingdom that is neither sky nor sea nor earth, but beneath all three, and his removal from Olympus is a consequence of the lot itself, a structural feature of the division rather than any slight or exclusion. The souls that move through Hades' realm move in steady procession. That procession would have seemed, to someone imagining it in the ancient Greek world, both enormous and calm. Everyone who had ever died, every generation back to the earliest ones, every person from every city and island and region of the Greek world, everyone who had drowned in Poseidon's sea, or been struck by Zeus's lightning, or died in the long wars, the tradition kept detailed records of. All of them had made their way down to Hades' country and were, in their way, still there. The underworld was not a temporary holding place in the Greek understanding. It was, with a few famous exceptions, where the dead remained. Hades ruled an enormous population in an enormous country in permanent silence below the earth. The broad earth lay between the three domains. That is the phrase Homer's tradition preserves, and it is worth sitting with. The broad earth, the sprawling, populated, worked and walked and fought over surface of the world, placed between the domain above it and the domain below it, and declared common to all three brothers, belonging to none of them exclusively. This was not a compromise, it was an agreement, and there is something in it that reflects a particular kind of intelligence in the arrangement, the recognition that the most contested and most inhabited part of the world could only remain stable if none of its three great sovereign neighbors could claim it outright. The earth needed to be open, the earth needed to be available to all three, and so it was declared to be. Then Olympus stood at the center of this open earth. The real mountain in the northern Greek landscape rises to approximately 2,918 meters, the tallest peak on the Greek mainland, a mountain whose upper reaches were often concealed by cloud, whose presence in the landscape was enormous and persistent and impossible to mistake for anything smaller than what it was. The tradition gradually came to imagine the divine Olympus as something larger and more abstract than the physical mountain, a heavenly precinct at the boundary between sky and earth, radiant and removed from weather, a place that existed in the same relationship to ordinary geography that the gods existed in to ordinary human beings. But in either understanding, whether as the physical peak or the heavenly abstraction, Olympus was common ground. All three brothers could walk on it. None needed to ask permission. The mountain that rose at the center of the world that had just been divided was in the terms of the agreement itself, the place where the division did not apply. There is something quietly generous in that, considered from a certain angle. Three great sovereigns, each of whom had just received a domain of enormous extent and power, nonetheless agreed that the most visible and inhabited portion of the world, and the mountain that presided over it, would remain open to all of them. The common ground was not a concession grudgingly extracted from someone who would have preferred to claim it. It was a part of the arrangement, accepted when the arrangement was made, incorporated into the terms of the division as one of its foundational features. The sky was Zeus's, the sea was Poseidon's, the underworld was Hades, the earth and the mountain belonged to all three, and to no one of them alone. What follows from this arrangement, in the tradition, is the entire subsequent history of the Greek mythological world, the gods making decisions that affected the earth, they all shared rights over, the disputes that arose when one brother's action on the common ground was felt to infringe on another's prerogative, the long detailed, many-generational drama of the divine court and the mortal world intertwined. But all of that followed from the lot drawing. All of it was a consequence, direct or indirect, of the moment when three brothers drew from a helmet and found that the world had been divided by the operation of chance into the shape it would hold for as long as the tradition was told. The lots themselves, once drawn, ceased to be physically important. They were objects used once for a purpose that could only be served once, and then they were done. The result they produced was what mattered. And the result they produced was a cosmos with a specific architecture, sky above, sea surrounding the land, underworld below, earth open in the middle, that matched with a kind of mythological precision the actual shape of the world as the ancient Greeks perceived it. The gods had not imposed an arbitrary structure on the world. They had, in drawing their lots, sorted themselves into the domains that the world already, in some sense, contained. Zeus above the clouds, Poseidon at the horizon of every sea, Hades in the deep country beneath the feet of anyone who walked on the earth. These were positions the world was already holding open, waiting for the lottery to assign them. The image of the three brothers before the drawing is one that the tradition never quite lets go of, even though it only appears explicitly in that 15th book of the Iliad. It persists beneath the surface of everything that follows, the understanding that the arrangement between them was chosen rather than imposed, that it rested on an agreement rather than on conquest or decree, that Zeus's rule over the sky was as legitimate as Poseidon's rule over the sea and Hades' rule over the underworld, because all three came from the same source, the same helmet, the same chance, the same single moment in which the world was given its shape. The earth afterward was wide and unpartitioned. It lay between the great domains, the way a threshold lies between the interior and the exterior of a house, belonging fully to neither, available to both, the place where the transition happens. Anyone walking on the earth in the ancient Greek world was walking on ground that was, in the formal terms of the mythological constitution of the cosmos, common to all three brothers. They could not claim it alone. They could not keep the others off it. The earth was, in the deepest sense, the place where the boundaries of the arrangement held least, and where the three great domains touched and overlapped and met. Olympus rose from that common earth and into the sky that Zeus had drawn by lot. The mountain's roots were in the ground that all three brothers shared. Its summit reached the air that belonged to one of them. It was, in its very shape, a meeting point, the axis around which the division was organized, without itself being divided. On its slopes and at its heights, the tradition would go on to build an entire civilization of the divine, courts and councils and ceremonies, and disputes and alliances, and marriages, and the long complex history of a court that ruled the world from the highest point the world offered. But all of that began with the earth being declared common ground, and the mountain being left open, and three brothers agreeing, without argument, without a word spoken in anger or resentment, that the most visible and living part of the world they had divided would remain, for as long as the arrangement held, the property of none of them alone. The quiet of that agreement is worth resting on for a moment. Not the drama of a war just ended, or the grandeur of a cosmos just given its permanent shape, but the specific quietness of three figures standing on common ground, each holding a result that had not been his choice, and had nonetheless become, in the instant it was drawn, the thing that defined him. Zeus with the sky above him in every direction, Poseidon with the horizon of a sea that had just been assigned to his authority, stretching out to the edge of sight, Hades with the knowledge of the great underground country that was waiting for him in the dark beneath their feet, and between them, the earth open, broad, unmarked by any border, belonging equally to all three, in a gesture that might have been the most practical necessity imaginable, or might have been, in some older and quieter part of the tradition, a kind of gift they gave each other, and gave the world at the same moment. The mountain stood at the center of it all. It would go on standing there. The wind moved across the broad earth in every direction, over the common ground that no god owned, under the sky that one god did, above the underworld that another god ruled, along the coastlines of the sea that the third had drawn as his own, and the lots, having been drawn, and having done what lots are meant to do, were finished. The world had the shape it would keep. The division was made. The agreement held. The light on Olympus does not arrive from any particular direction. It simply is, present from every angle at once, falling without shadow across surfaces that have never been rained on and never will be. Homer, in the oldest surviving account of the mountain's appearance, describes it as cloudless, as utterly still, as bathed in a brightness that belongs to no particular hour, because no hour has ever changed it. The wind that moves across every other high place in the world, that strips the summits of ordinary mountains, that carries snow sideways in the cold months, and forces travelers to lean into it with their whole weight, that wind does not reach Olympus. Whatever the tradition holds about the nature of the gods, it holds this about the place they inhabit, that it exists at the edge of weather, past the point where weather begins. To approach it in the mind is to feel the quality of the air change before anything else does. The sounds of the world below, the sea moving, the olive groves shifting in the afternoon wind, the particular low note of a populated valley going about its ordinary business. Those sounds do not carry this far. What replaces them is not silence exactly. It is more like the state just before sound, a stillness that is complete enough to feel like its own kind of atmosphere, clean and even and without variation. The floors of the divine halls described in the tradition as polished and reflective catch that light without interruption. Nothing casts a shadow. Nothing moves that has not chosen to move. This is Olympus as the oldest Greek sources imagined it. Not merely a tall mountain in northern Greece, though the real mountain does stand above the surrounding land at nearly 3,000 meters. Bayesican's Greeks could look toward its summit from great distances and watch the clouds assemble and dissolve around it at their leisure. The physical mountain was always there, but the divine Olympus that the tradition elaborated over centuries slowly separated itself from the geographical one, becoming something more like a region of the sky than a location on the earth, a realm at the upper boundary of the world, where the sky and the summit meet, and neither fully gives way to the other. In that space between, held in permanent light, the gods made their court. The halls themselves were made of bronze and precious metal, and the tradition is specific about who made them. Hephaestus, the god of the forge and the divine craftsman, built the gleaming structures of Olympus, shaping metal with a craftsman's patience into walls and thresholds and doors that fit their frames with precision. Homer in the Iliad describes Hephaestus as the builder of the gods' palaces, the maker of their thrones, the artisan responsible for the physical form of the divine court. Each hall belonged to a different god. Each was made to house an immortal being who would occupy it not for a season or a century, but for the whole of time, as long as time continued. The work that went into them was, in that sense, work done without any expectation of being finished with them. Hephaestus made them to last, in the way that only an immortal craftsman can make something, not as a mortal builder constructs a house, anticipating the generations who will outlive it, but as a maker who will also still be present when everything he made is still standing exactly as he left it. The court that assembled in those halls was not assembled informally. The canonical grouping of 12 Olympian gods, the Dodekathoi, as they came to be called, was a recognized concept across ancient Greece, and the tradition held that the gods gathered in their proper number around Zeus as the acknowledged center of their assembly. The altar of the 12 gods in the Athenian Agora, established in the 6th century before the Common Era, stands as among the earliest surviving physical evidence of their worship as a collective. 12 deities recognized not merely as individual objects of cult, but as a unified court, with Zeus at its head. The altar did not name them in stone or distinguish them by individual deed. It held them together as a group, the way the tradition held them together, 12 gathered around one. What that gathering looked like, when the tradition describes it, is a scene of organized grandeur without urgency. The gods reclined on their thrones, which Hephaestus had made for them, shaped to hold an immortal body with the ease that a craftsman's knowledge of the materials allows. They ate and drank, and what they ate and drank was not what mortals ate and drank. Nectar was the divine drink, honey golden, warm, carried in vessels among the assembled gods by the one whose specific role it was to carry it. Ambrosia was the divine food, associated with the sweetness of things that sustain immortality rather than merely sustaining life. The distinction mattered to the tradition. Mortals ate bread and drank wine, and mortals aged and died. The gods at their table ate and drank the specific substances of their own continued existence, and they did not age, and they did not die, and the banquet at which they did this was not an occasion, but a state, the normal condition of the Olympian court, when nothing else was happening. The one who moved among them with the nectar, in the oldest version of the arrangement, was Hebe. She was the daughter of Zeus and Hera, and her name means youth in Greek, not merely the condition of being young, but the divine principle of youth as a permanent, embodied thing. To be served by Hebe was to receive youth's gift, which was also the gift of nectar, which was also the ongoing gift of immortality maintained. Homer, in the 4th book of the Iliad, places her in this role without particular elaboration, as though it is simply a known fact about how the divine court functions. The gods gather, and Hebe brings the nectar, and the gods receive it. She moves among the thrones with the particular ease of someone performing a function that has never been questioned, because it has always been exactly right. The gods receive their drink. The court continues. Later, Ganymede took up the role that had been Hebe's. He came from Troy, the tradition holds, a mortal prince of exceptional beauty, the most beautiful of mortal men, according to the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, which recounts how Zeus brought him to Olympus and granted him immortality and the position of cupbearer to the gods. What that arrival would have felt like for someone arriving from a mortal world into a place of bronze halls and permanent light is something the tradition does not linger on. The Homeric hymn gives the fact, without dwelling on the transition. Ganymede was taken, given immortality, made the wine pourer of the gods, and from that point forward he was part of the court. What he saw when he first looked up at those halls, the specific quality of the light on the metal, the scale of the thrones, Hephaestus had built for beings who were never going to stop occupying them. The tradition leaves all of that to whatever space the listener fills it with. Ganymede is described as pouring wine in later sources, which distinguishes his function slightly from Hebe's, nectar for the older account, wine in the later mythological imagination. But the position itself remained the same, a figure moving among the assembled gods with a vessel in hand, the court receiving what was brought to it in the unhurried rhythm of a gathering that has no particular end time and no reason to hurry toward one. Whether Hebe or Ganymede held the vessel, the role itself remained constant, the act of service at the divine table, performed in the radiant stillness of a hall where nothing spoiled and nothing ran out. The divine court required more than a cupbearer. It required someone who understood the nature of assembly itself, who knew what made a gathering of gods legitimate rather than merely numerous, what distinguished a formal convening of the divine court from a casual collection of immortal beings in the same space. That function belonged to Themis. Her name in Greek means something closer to divine law, or that which is established, than to law as mortals understand it in courts and treaties. Themis is the prior condition, not the rule imposed on an existing situation, but the quality that makes an ordered situation possible at all. She is the oldest law, which is also the deepest law, which is also the law that the gods themselves acknowledge without needing to be reminded of it. In Pindar's Pythian Odes, the tradition holds that Themis was the first deity invited by the fates to become Zeus's bride, a position she held before Hera, preceding even the marriage that produced the Queen of Olympus. The significance of that ordering is not simply biographical. It says something about the relationship between divine kingship and divine law, that Zeus's authority was established not through power alone, but through a prior union with the principle of order itself, a union that made the court he then assembled a court in the fullest sense, rather than merely a gathering of powerful beings under a single roof. Themis was present at the beginning of the Olympian order. Her presence was, in a sense, what made it orderly. In the divine court, Themis held the specific function of summoning the gods to their assemblies. Ancient art depicts her seated beside Zeus as his counselor, the figure at his right, whose advice was sought, and whose understanding of right arrangement ran deeper than any individual god's interest in any particular outcome. To summon the gods to assembly was not merely a practical act, a matter of sending messages and waiting for arrival. It was an act that invoked the principle Themis embodied. When the gods came together at her summoning, they came together in the frame that made their gathering legitimate, rather than merely large. The assembly was already ordered by the time anyone sat down, because the figure who called it into being was the figure in whose nature order resided. She stood at the threshold of the divine assembly, and her presence was the signal, not the sound of a horn or the announcement of an agenda. Simply her presence, Themis, at the entrance to the hall, meaning that the hall was now a place where the gods assembled properly, where whatever was decided in it carried the weight of divine law rather than divine preference. The gods who entered passed her, and in passing her acknowledged the frame within which their gathering took place. Whatever arguments arose inside, whatever positions were taken, whatever decisions emerged, all of it happened within the order that Themis's presence established around it. She did not resolve the arguments. She made it possible for the arguments to be arguments rather than noise. The court assembled, then with its cupbearer at the table, and its counselor at the threshold, and its thrones arranged across floors that caught the light evenly in every direction. 12 gods gathered in their proper number. Above them, physically above them, his domain extending from the Olympian hall upward through every layer of the sky, Zeus presided, his authority located not only in the lot that had fallen to him and given him the sky, but in the specific way the court had been constituted around him. Its positions were filled. Its roles were inhabited by beings suited to inhabit them. Its physical space had been made by someone who made things with permanent care. It was, by every measure the tradition applied to such things, a court that was complete. The banquet at the center of it deserves a moment on its own, not the food or the drink which have already been named, but the quality of the occasion itself, the particular ease of immortal beings gathered in a space built to receive them, eating the food of immortality and drinking the drink of divine life, with no hunger they needed to anticipate and no scarcity they needed to guard against. The Olympian banquet was not a celebration of something that had happened or might happen. It was simply the ongoing condition of the court, the gods present, the table set, the nectar poured, the assembled divine beings in the specific ease of their own existence. Mortal feasts have this quality sometimes, in the best moments, the meal that does not seem to need to end, the gathering in which nobody has checked how late it has become. The divine banquet was that quality made permanent, installed at the center of the cosmos, held in a hall that weather had never entered. The gods who came to that table came with their own histories, their own functions, their own domains already assigned or long assumed. They were not equals in the way that identical beings might be equal. Each one was irreducibly what they were, and what they were differed enormously from god to god. Hera beside Zeus was the queen of the court, holding authority over the institution of marriage and the lives of women across the mortal world. Her status within the divine hierarchy immediately visible in the throne. Hephaestus had made for her, placed in its proper position in the hall. Athena was already present, wisdom having already been installed in the court's intellectual life in a form the tradition would elaborate. Artemis and Apollo were twin children of Zeus, each holding dominion over specific and vast regions of existence, the hunt, the moon, and the living world on one side, light, music, prophecy, and the sun on the other. Hermes moved at the edges of the court with the particular alertness of the god's messenger, ready to carry whatever needed carrying to wherever it needed to go. Ares stood in the court as the god of war's specific energies, not war as strategy or as human bravery, but war as the force that drives combat itself, the thing underneath the battle, rather than the battle's outcome. Each of them occupied a position in the court that reflected the nature of what they were. This is one of the things the tradition preserved most carefully about the dodecathoi, that the 12 were not 12 identical divine beings, assigned different portfolios by administrative arrangement, but 12 beings whose specific natures suited them to their specific functions in the way that a craftsman's tools suit the work they were made for. Hephaestus made things from metal because metal and making were what he was. Poseidon held the sea because the sea's particular nature, its vastness, its depth, its capacity for both sustaining life and ending it, matched something in his own. Demeter held the grain and the seasons of the earth because abundance and its withdrawal were what she carried within her, The court was organized along the lines of what the gods actually were, not along the lines of what Zeus had decided to assign them. This is not a small distinction. It means that the Olympian court, as the tradition describes it, was not a hierarchy maintained by the king's ongoing willingness to enforce it, but a gathering of beings whose arrangement reflected something true about each one of them and about the world they inhabited. Zeus presided from above, from the sky, from the position the lot had given him, and that his nature suited him for. The others occupied their positions in the court, because those positions were theirs in a way that went beyond assignment. Hephaestus would have been the craftsman of the gods, whether or not anyone had given him the title, because making things with extraordinary precision out of extraordinary materials was not a role he had been given, but a nature he had been born from. Still, the physical structures of the court existed because of Hephaestus's work specifically, because a divine craftsman had applied his skill to the problem of housing immortal beings in a manner worthy of them. The halls of Olympus were not there by convention or by Zeus's decree. They were there because Hephaestus had made them, had brought to the project everything a god of craftsmanship brings to any work, which is an understanding of materials that goes all the way down to the nature of what the materials are, rather than only to the surface of how they behave. Bronze made by Hephaestus was not simply bronze. It was bronze that had been understood and worked and shaped by a mind that grasped what bronze could be pushed to do, what forms it could hold, what loads it could carry across what periods of time without failing. The halls he built would stand for as long as the gods themselves stood in them. They were not more durable than the gods, but they were as durable, and that was exactly right. The thrones he made were of the same kind, each one fitted to the being who would sit in it, which required Hephaestus to understand each being well enough to make something shaped to their specific nature, rather than to a general notion of divine authority. A throne for Hera was not a throne for Athena. A throne for Ares was not a throne for Demeter. The craftsman who made all of them had to know all of them in the way that only long attention to a subject produces knowledge, not the knowledge of being told facts about something, but the knowledge of having worked closely with a material or a problem or a person until the understanding runs deep enough to feel instinctive. Hephaestus had that knowledge. His work in the divine court showed it. He also built the doorways, the great golden doors, in some versions of the tradition that opened onto the divine precinct, that the Horae, the goddesses of the seasons, were said to open and close as the gods departed from Olympus and returned to it. The doorways fitted their frames with the precision of everything Hephaestus made. They opened smoothly. They closed without force. The threshold they marked was the threshold between the court and everything outside it, between the permanent light and the world where weather was still happening, where seasons changed and rain fell and mortals went about their lives under a sky that belonged to Zeus, but that they experienced not as dominion, but simply as sky. When the gods passed through those doorways in either direction, they passed from one order of existence to another, inward. The cloudless hall, the banquet arranged without urgency, Themis at the threshold, Ganymede with the vessel, the thrones receiving their occupants in the light that fell from every direction at once. Outward, a world with weather and time and mortal consequence, a world in which the gods' actions had effects, and the effects had histories, and the histories accumulated into something that mortals tried to understand and remember and pass on to whoever came after them. The court was the center. The world was the circumference. The doorways Hephaestus built were the point where both met. The tradition held the divine court in considerable detail across many sources and many centuries, which means the image of Olympus that survived into the modern world is not a single image, but a composite assembled from Homer and Hesiod and Pindar and the dramatic poets and the visual artists who decorated temple pediments and painted pottery and carved friezes for buildings whose purposes ranged from the civic to the deeply devotional. Each of those sources added something, and not all of what they added was entirely consistent with what the others had said. The number 12, for instance, was broadly agreed upon, but the specific 12 varied somewhat by region and tradition. Whether Hestia or Dionysus occupied the 12th position, for example, was a question that different parts of the Greek world answered differently. The court was 12. Which 12? Exactly depended on where one was asking. What remained consistent across those variations was the broad shape, a gathering of major deities under Zeus's authority, meeting in a hall of divine craftsmanship on a mountain of permanent light, served in specific ways by specific figures whose roles were as carefully defined as the gods' own natures. Hebe with her vessel of nectar, Ganymede following her in that role. Themis at the threshold, making the gathering possible by making it orderly. Hephaestus at his forge at the edge of the precinct, still working, still shaping something, still bringing to the material in his hands the same attention he had brought to every other thing he had ever made for the court. The fixed elements persisted, the details varied, and the variation itself is part of what the tradition preserved. Not a single immovable picture of the divine court, but a living body of description that different communities contributed to over many generations, each one adding its own angle to a view of something that none of them could fully contain. The Athenian altar to the 12 gods stood in the agora, the open meeting ground at the center of the city, the place where civic life was conducted and commerce moved and public ceremony was held. Its placement was deliberate. The 12 who inhabited the light of Olympus also presided over the ordinary life of the city, over the arguments and the trades and the religious observances and the political assemblies of mortal beings going about their existence in the world those gods governed. The altar was not a temple, it was simpler than that, a place of collective acknowledgement, built in the 6th century before the Common Era, in the middle of the city's most active and populated space. It said, the 12 are present here, not only on their mountain, here, in this market square, in the dust and the crowd and the ordinary morning, the 12 are present. What remains of that altar is not much by the measure of stone or inscription. What it attests to, though, is the reality of collective divine worship as an organized practice. 12 deities recognized together, their court honored not individually, but as a court, the gathered divine assembly mirrored in a gathered human one, the mortal city acknowledging the divine city that rose above it in permanent white light. The altar has been gone for a very long time. The fact that it was there persists in the archaeological record, and that persistence is its own kind of testimony. The city built an altar to all 12 together, and what the city built there carried the specific meaning of recognizing the court as a court, the 12 as a unity, the divine assembly as something that could be addressed collectively, rather than only one god at a time. The halls Hephaestus built on Olympus were built with the same understanding of what they were for, not for any one god, though each god had a hall of their own, for the gathered 12, for the court as a whole, for the assembly that Themis summoned and Zeus presided over, and Hebe and Ganymede served, and all the gods of the Dodeca Theoi inhabited in their proper positions on their proper thrones. The bronze walls held the light evenly, the polished floors reflected it upward, the doorways fitted their frames, the thrones received their occupants, Nothing here was made roughly or provisionally or with the expectation that it might need to be replaced. Everything was made to the measure of immortality, which is the only measure a craftsman working for the gods could honestly apply. The divine banquet continued in that hall as it had always continued. Nectar poured, ambrosia offered, the assembled gods in the ease of their own existence, in the light that came from no particular direction and failed to cast shadows on surfaces that had never been rained on. The sounds of the world below, the sea, the olive groves, the cities going about their particular days, did not reach here. What the gods said to each other in that hall, what counsel Themis offered, what observations the gods made about the mortal world visible beneath them, all of that the tradition has preserved in fragments and in poems and in the specific careful work of sculptors who rendered the divine assembly in stone for the pediments of temples built to honor one or another of the 12. The court was there before the stories began. It will be there after the last of them ends. The gods occupy their thrones with the patience of beings who have no reason to stand up, and the light falls without shadow across floors that weather has never reached. And somewhere at the edge of the divine precinct, Hephaestus is still working, a piece of metal in his hands, a fire at the right heat, the tools moving with the calm of someone who has done this long enough that the movements themselves carry knowledge, whose hands understand the material in a way that requires no deliberation, because the understanding has gone past deliberation into something simpler and more complete. He is making something. What it is will be exactly right for whatever it is for. He has always worked this way. The court he built has always looked this way, radiant, still, cloudless, open to the light at the upper edge of the world where the sky begins, the halls gleaming, the thrones set in their positions, and the gods of the dodecatheoi gathered in the particular ease of beings who are exactly where they were always going to be. Beneath the earth, in the time before Zeus had ever held anything in his hands that could be called a weapon, 3 brothers were working by firelight. Their names, in the oldest Greek telling, were Brontes, Sterapos, and Arges, thunder, lightning, and bright, and Hesiod's theogony gives them to the tradition in that order, 3 cyclopes, whose single eyes caught the glow of the forge, the way still water catches the sun. The underground where they worked was not the domain of the dead. It was something older than that, a space defined by heat and pressure and the sound of metal being struck, a place where nothing existed yet in finished form, where everything was still in the process of becoming what it would eventually be. The Cyclopes had been there for a very long time. They had been placed in Tartarus by their own father, Erinox, who feared them, and they had remained there through the long age of the Titans, through the darkness that preceded the war, through the war itself, working, waiting, holding whatever knowledge they carried about what could be made from the materials the deep earth provided. When Zeus finally freed them, the tradition holds that they gave him a gift. The gift was the thunderbolt. What the theogony preserves of this moment is simple and exact. The Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, Arches, shaped the Kyrinos, the thunderbolt in their forge beneath the world, and when it was finished, it carried inside it the specific properties of each brother's name. It had the sound of thunder, it had the character of lightning, it had the quality of brightness. Before Zeus first held it, no such object existed anywhere in the cosmos, not in the sea, not in the sky, not on the broad earth, not in the deepest places below the earth. It was made in darkness, and it was made of light, and that particular combination is exactly what the Cyclopes were suited to produce. The forge itself is worth dwelling on for a moment. the specific sensory reality of what Hesiod implies without fully describing. Stone walls, heat that had nowhere to go, the rhythmic sound of hammering that echoed against surfaces too close together, building on itself, filling the underground chamber with a noise that would have been, in a smaller space, almost unbearable. Metal that began as raw material pulled from the earth's own substance, shaped by hands that the tradition describes as belonging to one-eyed giants, craftsmen whose work would eventually be attributed also to Hephaestus, the divine smith, but who here, in the deepest source, are themselves doing this specific thing for the first time in any world that has ever existed. The first Keranos was not a copy of something that already existed. It was the original. Whatever brightness it produced when the hammer struck, it was a brightness the underground had not seen before. And when it was finally finished and lifted clear of the forge, the light it cast would have been the first light those particular walls had ever known. Hesiod records the Cyclops' names and their meanings without ceremony, the way the oldest Greek sources tend to record things they consider simply true, not with flourish, not with the tone of someone revealing a secret, but with the matter-of-fact precision of a tradition that has held this information for a very long time and sees no reason to perform surprise at its own contents. Thunder, lightning, bright, three brothers, one object. The gift was given, and Zeus received it, and from that point forward, the thunderbolt was inseparable from any account of who Zeus was and what his authority consisted of. Not merely as a decoration on coins and temple friezes, though it appears there too, reliably across the full extent of the Greek and Roman worlds, but as the primary image through which the idea of divine kingship became visible to the human eye. The Keranos appears on coins minted across the Greek world, on the carved metopes of temples, on the hands of Zeus as sculptors rendered him in bronze and marble and ivory. In votive offerings at Zeus's shrines, small thunderbolts made of terracotta and bronze were left by worshippers as the proper symbol of the god being addressed. Pausanias, the Greek travel writer of the 2nd century, describes seeing thunderbolt iconography at sanctuary after sanctuary as he moved through the Greek mainland. The object that began in Hesiod's underground forge had become, over the centuries between that telling and Pausanias's walking tours, the most recognizable divine emblem in the ancient Mediterranean world. The thing you drew or carved or cast when you needed to indicate, without any supporting text, that what you were depicting had something to do with Zeus. What makes this particular origin worth attending to, for a moment longer than it might seem to require, is the specific logic it contains. The thunderbolt was not something Zeus found. It was not something he took. It was made for him as a gift by craftsmen who were themselves divine, who had been imprisoned, and who were freed by the act that made the gift possible. The chain of cause and consequence runs in one direction: liberation, then gratitude, then the making of the object, then the gift. The Keranos in this telling is not a weapon seized in conquest. It is a thing that came into being because a specific act of justice, the freeing of the Cyclops from an unjust imprisonment, was performed, and the tradition chose to remember it that way. The Aegis arrived in the tradition by a different route, and its description across ancient sources is notably varied, more varied in fact than almost any other object associated with Zeus, which may say something about how old the concept is and how many different imaginations have worked on it over the centuries. In Homer's Iliad, the Aegis is shaken by Zeus and by Athena, to whom Zeus lends it, and the effect of that shaking on the gods and mortals below is described as a kind of spreading panic, a sudden failure of nerve, a stillness that falls over an army, the way silence falls over a field when something large moves through the grass nearby. The Iliad's aegis is fringed with tassels. It has the specific visual quality of something that catches light and movement at once, something that is both decorative and, when moved in a particular way, alarming in a manner that is difficult to account for or resist. One tradition that survives in several ancient sources connects the aegis directly to the goat Amalthea, who nursed Zeus in his infancy on Crete. In this account, the skin of the divine goat, herself an extraordinary creature, strong enough and sacred enough to have fed the king of the gods in the period of his concealment, before he had any power at all, became the material from which the aegis was eventually made. What was once the covering of the animal that kept Zeus alive when he was hidden from his father was transformed, over the long arc of his growing power, into the covering that marked his authority when that power was fully established. The circularity is quiet but present. The thing that protected him when he was helpless became, eventually, the thing through which his protection extended outward to the rest of the world. The aegis, in this account, is not simply a manufactured object in the way the thunderbolt was manufactured in the Cyclops' forge. It has a biological origin. It was once alive. The goatskin carries inside it the memory of a specific time and a specific place, the caves of Crete, the infant god, the extraordinary animal who was nourishing enough to sustain what would become the most powerful figure in the cosmos. Ancient artists rendered the aegis differently across different periods and different media, sometimes as a shield, sometimes as a breastplate, sometimes as a fringed cloak worn across one shoulder, sometimes as something that defies easy categorization and seems to belong to multiple forms simultaneously. The inconsistency is not a failure of the tradition. It may be the tradition accurately representing the fact that the aegis was understood to be genuinely unusual, not quite like any other object, not reducible to a single function or a single shape, as strange in its origin as anything the gods possessed. The eagle, called Atos in Greek, enters the tradition from a different direction entirely. It is not made by craftsmen and not derived from a material object. It is a living creature, a species of bird, and what the tradition held about it was that the eagle's behavior in the sky above a Greek hillside carried information. Specifically, the direction and manner of an eagle's flight was understood by augurs, those whose formal role it was to read such signs as a message from Zeus, the bird's appearance at a particular moment, its movement to the left or the right, its altitude, its speed, the sound of its wings. All of this was legible to those trained in the reading of it, in the same way that a letter is legible to someone who knows the alphabet. This practice of reading eagle flight as divine communication was not casual or peripheral in the ancient Greek world. It was formalized, it was taken seriously, and it persisted across centuries of Greek religious life. Homer's Odyssey depicts Odysseus's father, Lars, reading the flight of an eagle as a sign relevant to the Ithacan situation, and the scene is treated as completely unremarkable, not a special or unusual act, but simply what a person with the right knowledge does when an eagle passes overhead. The bird in the sky is Zeus's message. The augur is the one who knows how to read it. And the message, whatever its specific content in any given situation, is authoritative in a way that nothing else can match, because it comes from the highest God, through the intermediary that the tradition specifically assigned to that function. What passed from the Greek world to the Roman world through this particular tradition is one of the most consequential inheritances in the history of political imagery. The Romans adopted the eagle directly and without significant modification as the symbol of imperial authority. When a Roman legion carried its Aquila, its eagle standard, into the field, the iconographic logic behind that object was the Jovian eagle of the Greek tradition, the bird whose flight Homeric Greeks had read as divine communication. The eagle of Roman imperial power was, in this sense, a Greek religious symbol translated into Latin political practice. The Atos of Zeus becoming the Aquila of the imperator, the same visual claim to supreme authority dressed in different institutional clothing. The specific bird that an augur on a Greek hillside watched moving toward the right horizon became, across the long transmission of the Mediterranean tradition, the emblem on the standards of armies that crossed from Britain to Mesopotamia. The oak tree moves through the tradition more slowly, and its relationship to Zeus is rooted, in the most literal possible sense, in a specific place. At Dodona, in the mountainous northwest of Greece, there was a sanctuary of Zeus, organized around a sacred oak, and the tradition held that the voice of Zeus could be heard in the sound the leaves of that oak produced when the wind moved through them. The priests at Dodona were called Seloi. Homer names them in the Iliad and notes that they slept on the ground and left their feet unwashed, practices that seem designed to maintain a specific and unmediated contact with the earth from which the oak grew. The priestesses were called Pleiades, and in the tradition their name connects them to doves, birds associated with oracular communication more broadly. Their role at Dodona was to interpret what the oak said, to translate the rustling of sacred leaves into the will of Zeus expressed in human language. Dodona is one of the oldest oracular sites in the Greek world, older, according to Herodotus, than Delphi, though the relative antiquity of these sites is a matter about which ancient sources are not entirely in agreement. What is clear is that the practice of consulting Zeus through his oak at Dodona was a long-established and respected tradition, that questions were brought there from across the Greek world, and that the answers received were treated with the seriousness due to a direct communication from the god, whose particular domain included the sky, the thunder, and, through his oak, the voice that came through the leaves on still or windy afternoons in that particular mountain valley in northwestern Greece. Homer refers to Dodona in the Odyssey when he has Odysseus consult the oracle to hear Zeus's will from the god's high-leafed oak. The phrase is worth pausing on, high-leafed. The quality of the oak is in its height, in its abundance of leaves, in the particular volume of sound it produces when the air moves through it, a sound that was, in that tradition, the voice of the highest god, reaching down through wood and leaf to the ears of those below who had made the journey to listen. The oak's sacred character within the cult of Zeus at Dodona had a practical quality that the thunderbolt and the eagle did not share. A person could stand beneath the oak. A person could hear the leaves. The tree was immediate in a way that a weapon forged by divine craftsmen underground is not, and in a way that a bird moving across a distant sky is not quite. What the oak offered was a version of divine presence that was local, rooted, available to the ear, the voice of Zeus mediated not through fire or feather, but through wood, through the biological fact of a living tree moving in weather, through the specific sound that oak leaves make, which is different from the sound of other leaves, which was why the oak at Dodona, and not some other species of tree, was the one through which the tradition heard the god speak. The wood of the oak remained associated with Zeus across the full breadth of the Greek religious world, not only at Dodona, but wherever Zeus was worshipped in context that involved natural settings and the outdoors. The god grove at Olympia was another such site, and the connection between Zeus, the oak, the thunder, and the storm is old enough that scholars of Greek religion have traced it to an early association between the king of the gods and the specific atmospheric phenomenon that oak trees, with their deep root systems and their height, attract during electrical storms more reliably than most other species. Whether or not that etymological and meteorological thread is where the connection began, it had, by the time the Homeric epics were composed, accumulated centuries of religious meaning and was simply understood as a given. The oak belonged to Zeus, and Zeus was present in the oak, and what the oak said when the wind came through was something worth traveling a long distance to hear. The scepter arrives in the tradition carrying different weight than any of the other objects, the weight not of origin, but of transmission, not of making, but of passing on. Hesiod and Homer both know the object. The scepter of Zeus, the skeptron, was made by Hephaestus. In Homer's Iliad, the scepter appears in one of the most precisely described moments of divine to mortal inheritance in the entire epic tradition, where Homer tells the reader exactly how this particular object traveled from the hand that made it to the hand that currently holds it. Hephaestus made it for Zeus. Zeus gave it to Hermes. Hermes gave it to Pelops. From Pelops it passed to Atreus, from Atreus to Thyestes, and from Thyestes eventually to Agamemnon, the king of kings, who holds it in the Iliad as the assembled Greek forces prepare to deliberate on the plains before Troy. That chain of names, Hephaestus, Zeus, Hermes, Pelops, Atreus, Thyestes, Agamemnon, contains an entire theory of legitimate authority inside it. The scepter was not Agamemnon's by invention, or by conquest, or by the assertion of force. It was Agamemnon's because the object that he held had been held by a succession of figures before him, each one giving it to the next in a sequence that began with a god and moved step by step into the mortal world, until a mortal king stood on a battlefield holding an object whose earliest owner was the craftsman of the Olympian court. The authority the scepter represented was therefore not generated by Agamemnon or by any of his immediate predecessors. It was inherited. It arrived in human hands from divine ones, and the specific chain of its inheritance was something Homer considered worth narrating precisely in the full sight of his audience, because the precision of that chain was exactly what gave the object its weight. What the scepter illustrates, held at a slight distance and turned slowly in the light of what the tradition records about it, is the particular Greek understanding of how divine authority moved through the world. It did not stay on Olympus. It did not remain exclusively in the possession of the gods. Through specific and documented acts of transmission, a gift here, a bequest there, an inheritance passing from father to son across the generations of a single royal house, the authority that had its source in Zeus reached down into the human world and settled, for a time, in the hands of mortal kings. Those kings were not gods, they were not divine in themselves, but the objects they held and the offices those objects represented carried the trace of their divine origin, and the tradition knew this and kept the record of it carefully. The skeptron in Agamemnon's hand is a god's object in a mortal hand. The chain that connects those two things is long enough to span the distance between Olympus and the plains before Troy, and that distance, in the Greek understanding, is very considerable. The fact that the chain holds, that the object arrives in mortal hands without losing the authority it carries, says something about how the Greeks conceived of the relationship between divine power and human kingship. Power, in this tradition, can be transmitted. Authority can travel. What was made by Hephaestus for Zeus does not cease to be what it was made to be, simply because it is now held by Agamemnon. It carries its origin inside it, the way a river carries the memory of its source, through every landscape it crosses on its way to the sea. Each of these 5 objects, the Keranos, the Aegis, the eagle, the oak, the scepter, belongs to Zeus in a different way. The thunderbolt was made for him. The Aegis was made from something that had sustained him. The eagle was recognized as his messenger by the behavior of a living species in the sky. The oak was given voice by the tradition that chose to hear his speech in the movement of its leaves. The scepter was made by his craftsmen, held by him, and sent by him into the world to mark the legitimate authority of those who followed. 5 different relationships between a god and the things the tradition used to make him visible and present and real to the human world below his sky. The tradition does not present these relationships as equally old or equally well attested. The thunderbolt is everywhere in the Greek record, on every coin, in every temple sculpture, in every votive context where Zeus is the subject. The Aegis is common, but less uniform, its form shifting across periods and media in a way that suggests the concept was never entirely fixed. The eagle and the oak are ancient in a different register, the register of religious practice rather than artistic convention, of augury and oracular consultation rather than sculptural iconography. The scepter is specific to the epic tradition and to the particular theory of divinely sanctioned kingship that the Iliad embodies and carries forward. None of these is simply decorative. Each one is doing something, representing something, encoding something, making legible something about the nature of divine authority and the different channels through which that authority could be experienced in the ancient Greek world. The Cyclopes in their forge, the goat Amalthea on the slopes of Crete, the eagle crossing a Greek hillside, the oak at Dodona in its mountain valley, Hephaestus at his anvil, making an object that will eventually rest in the hand of a mortal king before Troy. These are not interchangeable images. They come from different strata of the tradition, from different periods and different regions and different forms of religious practice. And the fact that they were all drawn together over time into the constellation of things associated with a single god says something about how capacious that god's authority was understood to be. Zeus's domain, in the tradition that the Greeks developed and maintained across many centuries, was not narrow. It included the sky and the thunder and the lightning and the rain and the movement of birds and the voice of trees and the legitimate succession of kings. The objects associated with him were as various as the things he governed. The oak at Dodon, on a still afternoon in the mountain valley of Epirus, produced a sound that the priestesses cupped their hands to hear more clearly. Their faces turned up toward the canopy, where the leaves were moving in air, too subtle to be felt at ground level. What the tree said, in the account the tradition preserves, was the will of Zeus, speaking through living wood, because the living wood was, in that tradition, one of the forms his presence took in the world below his sky. The sound of the leaves, and the light of the thunderbolt, and the flight of the eagle, and the weight of the scepter in a mortal hand are all, in their different ways, the same thing, the god making himself known through the specific forms and objects and creatures that the tradition assigned to him, each one a different register of the same authority, each one a different way the world had learned to recognize who it was that moved through the sky above it. The scepter of Zeus passed from divine hands to mortal ones and continued traveling long after the Iliad recorded its path. The thunderbolt remained in the hand of the god, lighting the sky above every landscape the Greek tradition inhabited. The eagle went on being watched by those who knew how to read it. The oak at Dodona went on making the sound that the Pleiades interpreted, season after season, through the long continuance of that particular oracle. And the Aegis fringed goatskin, strange even by the standard of divine objects, went on being lent by Zeus to his daughter when the tradition needed something to represent a sudden and unquestionable authority, spreading over a field of battle, or over any situation that required the sky to make clear, through some visible intermediary, that a decision had been made and would not be reversed. What these objects share taken together is not a common origin or a common function, but a common direction. They all move outward from Zeus into the world. The thunderbolt descends from the sky. The eagle crosses from one horizon to the other. The oak sends its sound down from the height of its canopy to the ground where the priests and priestesses stand listening. The scepter travels from Olympus through Hermes to Pelops, and then downward through the mortal generations to Agamemnon on the plain before Troy. Everything associated with this god has this quality of outward movement, of authority extending itself from a center that is very high into a world that is very wide. The sky is the largest domain in the Greek cosmology. What belongs to the sky reaches, eventually, everywhere. The forge where the thunderbolt was made has been cold for a very long time. In any accounting, Brontes, Steropes, and Arges completed their work and gave their gift, and the object moved into the tradition and stayed there, reappearing on every coin struck in the name of a god whose symbol it had become, in every temple pediment where the sculptor needed to indicate divine authority without depicting a face, in every religious context where something needed to signal that the highest god was present or was being addressed. The gift the Cyclopes made in the dark, by firelight with their hands, traveled further than any object made underground has any right to travel. It went from a forge below the world to the summit of the sky. It went from the hands of three brothers whose names meant the properties it was being given, to the hand of the god who would carry those properties forward into every age of the tradition. The scepter moved along its own long path, from Hephaestus who made it, to Zeus who received it, to Hermes who carried it, as the divine messenger carries everything entrusted to him, down into the mortal world through Pelops and the kings of Mycenae, until it rested in the hand of Agamemnon, who held it above a gathering of Greek warriors on a shore that the tradition has never quite finished describing. An object made by the craftsman of the gods for the king of the gods, now held by a mortal king above a mortal army, the chain of its transmission running unbroken from the highest point in the cosmos to that particular beach, that particular man, that particular moment in the long story the Iliad chose to tell. The authority inside the scepter did not diminish as it traveled. That was the point of the chain. That was what the chain was for, to show that the authority was real enough and durable enough to survive the long journey from its source without losing what it had been made to carry. What a single object can carry, when the tradition loads it carefully with the weight of origin and transmission and legitimate inheritance, is something the Greek myths understood very well. The Keranos carried thunder and lightning and brightness and the memory of the forge. The scepter carried the authority of Zeus through the hands of every figure who held it between its making and its moment in the Iliad. The oak at Dodona carried the voice of the god through its leaves to anyone who had made the journey to listen. And across all of this, across the forge and the goatskin and the eagle in its flight, and the oak in its mountain valley, and the scepter in its long descent through generations of increasingly mortal hands, the tradition maintained a consistent picture of a god whose authority was not simply asserted, but embodied, was not simply claimed but made tangible in specific objects, in specific creatures, and specific places where the human world and the divine world came into a particular and legible contact. The eagle is still in the air somewhere, in the tradition that preserved it. It crossed from one horizon to the other, while someone below stopped walking to watch it and read its direction as a message from the sky, the direction it was moving, and what that direction was understood to mean belongs to the full record of Greek augury, which is its own long story. What the tradition holds simply is that the bird and the god were connected, and that the connection was readable, and that those who knew how to read it did so with the same seriousness they brought to any other form of divine communication, because the eagle in the air was in that tradition, not a coincidence but a sign, not a bird moving through empty sky, but a message, already on its way to wherever the god intended it to arrive. A traveler arriving at a mortal doorway in the ancient Greek world was never quite alone at the threshold. The door itself held a meaning, the space between outside and inside, between stranger and host, between hunger and shelter. That space was watched over, held in the particular attention of Zeus, who carried among his many titles the name Zenios, meaning the god of guests. What happened at a threshold mattered, not as a courtesy between two people, but as an act performed in the sight of the divine, judged by a god whose authority over mortal conduct was understood to be both total and patient. The stranger standing at the door was, by the terms of the tradition, a figure Zeus had sent. To refuse him was not merely inhospitable, it was an offense against the order the cosmos ran on. Xenia, the institution of guest friendship, was among the most formally protected relationships in ancient Greek life. It carried obligations running in both directions. The host was required to offer shelter, food, and protection before asking the stranger his name or his purpose. The guest was required to behave with restraint, to accept what was offered without excess, and to depart without having disturbed the household that received him. And over both of them, invisible and invariant, stood Zeus Zenius, the guarantor of the code, the god whose name was invoked the moment a stranger appeared at a door, and someone inside had to decide what to do. The violation of Xenia was not treated by the tradition as a social failing. It was treated as a transgression against divine law, the kind that could draw Zeus's attention down from the sky. The mythology surrounding the Trojan War preserves one of the tradition's most complete illustrations of what Zeus's protection of guest friendship meant at the scale of an entire civilization. Paris, a prince of Troy, had traveled as a guest to the court of Menelaus, the king of Sparta. He had sat at Menelaus's table, he had eaten his host's bread, and slept under his host's roof, and then he had departed, taking with him Helen, the wife of the man who had offered him shelter. The offense, in the tradition's framing, was not simply abduction or desire or a failure of personal restraint. It was a violation of the sacred bond that Zeus himself had placed between host and guest. The war that followed, 10 years, an armada of ships, the burning of a great city, was understood in part as the working out of that violation's consequence, the machinery of Zeus, Xenia, grinding forward to its conclusion. The tradition held that the protection Zeus extended to strangers also reached those in a different kind of vulnerability. Suppliants, those who came not to a private door, but to a shrine, an altar, or a powerful person, begging for mercy or sanctuary. This was the domain of Zeus Haikisios, the protector of those who kneel. The supplicant's posture, hands extended, body lowered, the self made deliberately defenseless, was understood to place the supplicant under divine protection. To harm a supplicant was, by the logic of the tradition, to strike at something Zeus had already claimed as his own. These were not separate roles. Xenius and Hyxius were facets of the same function, Zeus as the god who stood, invisible and attentive, beside every mortal who who had made themselves vulnerable to another mortal's choice. Ovid's Metamorphoses, composed in the 1st century BCE, carries a story that holds these stakes with particular clarity. In the first book of that work, Zeus and Hermes descended from Olympus and walked across the earth as travelers, unremarkable, road-worn, carrying nothing that would distinguish them from ordinary men. They moved through a region of Phrygia, stopping at door after door, and at door after door they were refused. The doors stayed shut. The inhabitants of the valley turned them away. Neither the disguise nor the refusals are incidental to the story. The disguise was the test. The closedness of all those doors was the evidence. And somewhere at the end of a long road, on a hillside, there stood a small house, thatched roof, modest garden, the home of 2 elderly people named Baucis and Philemon, who had very little and offered everything they had. What Baucis and Philemon did follows the precise choreography of proper Xenia. They opened their door, they invited the strangers inside, they brought water for the travelers' feet, and arranged what food they had: olives, radishes, cheese, eggs, figs, and a humble wine, setting the table with what they could, and apologizing gently for what they could not. At some point in the evening, Philemon noticed that the wine bowl refilled itself whenever it was emptied, the level rising without any hand having touched it. He understood then, or the story says he understood, what manner of guests were sitting at his table. The 2 old people offered what they had because they believed it was right, not because they had recognized the gods. That was the point. The value of the gesture was precisely in its unconditional nature. The door opened before the knock, the food offered before the name was known. When morning came, the rest of the valley was gone. The houses that had shut their doors now lay beneath a still lake, and in their place, where Baucis and Philemon's house had stood, there was a temple. The 2 old people were offered a single wish, and what they asked for was to serve in that temple together, and to die together, so that neither would have to be the one left behind. The tradition says their wish was granted. In the end, at the moment of their deaths, they were transformed simultaneously into 2 trees, an oak and a linden, standing side by side at the entrance to the temple, still growing from the same ground, still present at the threshold that had once opened to 2 strangers. The story is not, by the terms of the tradition, about miracle or reward in the conventional sense. It is about the mechanics of divine law made visible. What Baucis and Philemon received was the logical consequence of what they had done, the pattern completing itself. What the valley received was the same. Zeus had stood at every door that night. Most of them had stayed shut. What followed was not punishment in the sense of a god losing patience. It was the system running as it was designed to run, the code of guest friendship carrying its own consequences forward without requiring anger to drive them. There were those in the tradition who tested the gods more deliberately and fared differently. Tantalus was a mortal king who had been given something almost no mortal was given, an invitation to dine among the gods themselves on Olympus. The sources describe him as a man uniquely favored, a figure who had earned, by some account of royal virtue or divine patronage, the remarkable privilege of sharing the table of the immortals. He had eaten their food, he had sat among them, he had been, by any measure the tradition could offer, a recipient of the highest hospitality the divine world could extend. What Tantalus then did, the act that defines his place in the tradition, was to take a son of his own, a boy named Pelops, and kill him, and prepare him as food, and serve him at a feast he offered in return to the gods. The sources give different accounts of why. One version holds that Tantalus wished to test whether the gods were truly omniscient, whether they would recognize the nature of what they were being served. Another suggests the act arose from a kind of deranged pride, the impulse of a man so elevated by divine favor that he had lost his sense of where the boundary between mortal and God actually ran. Whatever the specific motive the tradition assigned, the act itself had a particular character. It was a violation of the host's duty to the guest, a guest in this case who was a child, which made it a double violation, and it was a direct provocation aimed at the gods' capacity to know and judge. The gods did know. They recognized what was on the table and did not eat, or nearly did not. Demeter, absorbed in grief at the time, is said in some versions to have taken a piece of the shoulder before realizing the rest was refused. Pelops was restored, his shoulder replaced with ivory by the gods when they reassembled him, and Tantalus was taken to Tartarus, the deepest and most removed part of the underworld, where his punishment was arranged with a precision that matched the nature of his crime. He stood in water. The water reached to his knees, and above him branches hung down heavy with fruit, figs, pears, pomegranates, olives, clusters of dark grapes. Whenever he moved toward the water to drink, it receded. Whenever he reached upward toward the fruit, the branches drew back. He was not tortured. He was not struck or burned or broken. He was simply placed for eternity in an exact relationship with everything he desired, where satisfaction was always just within reach, and always, at the moment of reaching, withdrawn. The word tantalize carries his name forward into the English language. It means what Tantalus experienced, the specific quality of longing made perpetual by an object that remains permanently almost within grasp. What the tradition held about Tantalus's punishment was not merely that it was severe, it was that it was geometrically matched to what he had done. He had abused the privilege of access, the unique, extraordinary access he had been given to the divine table, and so his punishment consisted of access withheld forever from the most elementary satisfactions. The logic was the logic of a system, the same system that Zeus Senios upheld at mortal thresholds. The law held at every scale. A king who had eaten at the table of the gods received no more exemption from its consequences than the villagers of Phrygia who had refused to knock at the door. The tradition's mechanisms for enforcing divine law extended upward to the gods themselves. Even the Olympians were bound by a certain kind of oath to a standard from which they could not easily escape. The river Styx, the dark river winding through the underworld, the boundary between the living world and the kingdom of the dead, was held to be the most binding substance in the cosmos when invoked as the subject of a sworn promise. A mortal oath could be broken. An oath sworn by the gods might carry consequence, but an oath sworn by the Styx was categorically different. It was the kind that could not be unmade. Hesiod's Theogony records what happened to a god who swore by the Styx, and swore falsely. For a full year, the god was struck breathless and voiceless, unable to speak, unable to eat the nectar and ambrosia of the Olympian table, lying as though dead in a form that was incapable of death. For 9 years after that, the god was excluded from the feasts and the assemblies of the divine court. No participation in the gatherings of the gods, no seat at the table, no voice in what was decided. The exclusion lasted 9 complete years, and only after that span was the god permitted to return. The punishment was not physical in the way mortal punishment was physical. It was social and cosmic, an erasure of participation, a suspension of the god's place in the order that Zeus presided over. What the Styx oath made visible was a feature of Zeus's authority, that ran beneath all the more dramatic demonstrations of his power. He was not only a king who commanded, he was the guarantor of promise itself. When gods swore by the Styx, they were invoking the oldest, deepest, most geologically fixed feature of the underworld, the river that had run there before the current order of the cosmos was established, and placing their oath under the protection of that permanence. Zeus stood behind it. The breaking of such an oath was not merely a personal failing, it was a rupture in the fabric that held the cosmos in its current shape, and the consequences the tradition described were the cosmos correcting that rupture automatically, the way a stretched material returns to its original form. There was a god in the tradition who had refused the current order and suffered for it across a span of time, so long that the tradition struggled to contain it in ordinary narrative. Prometheus was a titan, not one of the titans who had fought against the Olympians, but a figure who had worked alongside Zeus in the creation of the current world. The tradition gives him credit for the making of human beings, or at least for their current form, and for the particular attachment to humanity that led him eventually to take an action Zeus had expressly forbidden. Fire was not a mortal possession. The tradition held that fire, real fire, the fire that cooked food and warmed houses and lit lamps and enabled the full range of human craft and warmth and survival, had been withheld from humanity by Zeus, and that it was Prometheus who stole it, carrying it from Olympus concealed within a hollow fennel stalk, and gave it to human beings without Zeus's permission. The act was deliberate. Prometheus knew what he was doing, and did it anyway, choosing the welfare of humanity over the explicit will of the king of the gods. What followed in Hesiod's account was a punishment calibrated to the nature of the crime. Prometheus had acted through time. He had inserted himself into the progression of human history, changed what human life would be from that point forward, made an irreversible alteration to the conditions under which mortals would exist. His punishment also operated through time, across a span that rendered ordinary human reckoning almost meaningless. He was chained bound with unbreakable chains to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains, a range stretching across the northeastern edge of the known world, remote from Olympus and remote from the human world he had sought to help. Each day an eagle descended. Each day it returned to the same place and the same task. And each night the wound repaired itself, the regenerating liver made whole again in the dark, so that the next day the eagle could return. Aeschylus took this myth and built a drama around it, Prometheus Bound, in which the chained titan speaks at length about what he did, why he did it, and what he believes about Zeus's authority over the cosmos. The Prometheus of Aeschylus is defiant and articulate. He describes Zeus as a tyrant whose reign is new and whose power is by certain prophecies, not permanent. He frames his own suffering as the cost of a choice made in full knowledge, a gift freely given to humanity, regardless of the consequence to himself. The drama is interested in Prometheus as a moral argument, not merely as a figure in a myth, but the tradition does not end with Prometheus chained and speaking. Eventually, after many ages, after a span the tradition measures in generations and centuries rather than years, Heracles came to the Caucasus. He was passing through on one of his labors, or traveling beyond the limits of the known world on his own trajectory, and he came to the rock and saw what was there and killed the eagle with an arrow. The chain was broken. Prometheus was freed. And this liberation was not a contradiction of Zeus's authority. It was, by the framing the tradition offered, something Zeus permitted. The span of punishment had run long enough. The balance of cosmic order was served. What had been decreed could, at the right moment, be revoked. not because Zeus had changed his position on the theft of fire, but because the punishment had accomplished what it was designed to accomplish, and the cosmos was better served by a liberated Prometheus than by one still chained. This is a detail the tradition preserved carefully. The liberation of Prometheus was not a theft or an oversight. Heracles did not free him behind Zeus's back. The act was understood to have happened within the framework of Zeus's authority, at a moment when Zeus judged that the time was correct. The system included the possibility of mercy, but mercy administered according to the same cosmic logic that had generated the punishment. What Prometheus had violated, the rule that fire belonged to the gods, that the conditions of human life were Zeus's to set, had been addressed by a punishment of sufficient duration and sufficient daily repetition that the principle had been, in some sense, upheld. Only then could the punishment end. The eagle came back to the same rock, across the same sky, day after day, for an interval so long that the myth simply declines to measure it in ordinary terms. That repetition, the daily return, the nightly repair, the daily return again, has a quality that the tradition uses elsewhere as a way of conveying the operation of cosmic law rather than personal anger. The eagle was not motivated by cruelty. It was performing a function, returning to complete its task the way water returns to the lowest point. The rock was impassive. The chain was simply the appropriate material for binding something that needed to be bound. The Caucasus Mountains stood at the edge of the world and did not judge the situation. The whole arrangement had the quality of natural law, impersonal, consistent, repeating exactly as designed until the moment it was no longer required. The tradition placed all of these mechanisms, xenia, the protection of suppliants, the binding power of oaths, the punishment of those who violated divine order, under the general authority of Zeus as the keeper of cosmic law. The Greek word for this function was dike, meaning justice, and it was not identical to what later philosophical traditions meant by that word. Dike in the tradition's usage was closer to the right ordering of things, the arrangement in which each category of being occupied its proper place, and the relationships between those categories were conducted according to established rules. Zeus upheld dike not by making it, but by enforcing it. The law existed as a feature of the cosmos, and Zeus was the god whose authority most completely aligned with its demands. There were mortal rulers throughout the Greek world who derived their authority from Zeus in this capacity. A king who ruled justly was understood to rule in alignment with Zeus's principle, and the tradition held that Zeus took a particular interest in the conduct of human governance. Rulers who abused their power, who extracted from their subjects more than the proper order allowed, who betrayed the trust of those under their protection. The tradition described these as offenses Zeus noticed, and the mythology of the Trojan War, of the house of Atreus, of the long chain of consequence that ran through the great narrative cycles of Greek myth, can be read in part as illustrations of what happened when the right order of earthly governance was violated and the consequence worked its way forward through time. The connection between Zeus's divine authority and mortal political legitimacy was not merely symbolic. Across the Greek world, Zeus was worshipped in his capacity as the god of political community, Zeus Polius, the god of the city and major political decisions. The opening of assemblies, the swearing of civic oaths, were conducted under his auspices. The Athenian agora contained an altar to Zeus, Agorios, Zeus of the marketplace and the civic gathering place, because the space where Athenian citizens met to deliberate was understood to be a space that Zeus watched over. The oath that Athenian citizens swore when they entered civic life invoked Zeus, and the tradition held that oath-breaking in civic contexts was an offense Zeus would not ignore. Across all of these contexts, the mortal threshold, the divine assembly, the rock in the Caucasus, the floor of the underworld where Tantalus stood in his unchanging posture, the tradition built a picture of a cosmos with a moral architecture, not a simple one, not one that promised proportional outcomes in every case, or that made goodness easy or automatically rewarded. The tradition was too honest for that, and too old, but one in which the categories of right conduct existed, in which the rules were known, and in which their violation carried into the future a consequence that would work itself out according to its own logic, slowly or quickly, in the lifetime of the one who violated them, or in the lifetimes of those who came after. Zeus was the figure at the center of that architecture, not because he had invented it. The tradition does not quite say that. What it says is that when Zeus became king of the gods, he aligned his authority with the laws that the cosmos already demanded, that he installed himself as the guarantor of the principles the world needed to function as a world. Xania had to be upheld for travelers to move safely across the earth. Oaths had to be binding for agreements between gods to hold. Suppliants had to be protected for those without power to have any recourse against those who had it. Prometheus's fire had to be addressed because the unilateral alteration of the human condition by a single god, unchecked, would have dissolved the order Zeus had been given to maintain. The punishment of Tantalus carries a different quality than the punishment of Prometheus. Tantalus had been offered something extraordinary and had used it to test the gods, had served the worst possible thing at a table they had trusted him to set. The punishment the tradition gave him was precise, almost elegant in its matching of offense to consequence. The man who had abused the privilege of access was placed for eternity in a situation where access was present but perpetually withdrawn. There was no anger visible in the arrangement. Tantalus stood in the water. The fruit hung above him. The whole construction had the quality of something designed, rather than something done in haste. Between these figures, the elderly couple on the hillside, the king in the water, the chained titan on the rock, the tradition traced the same underlying principle, the same law operating at different scales, and in response to different violations. Baucis and Philemon had upheld the threshold code. Without knowing what they were upholding, Tantalus had shattered it at the highest possible level. Prometheus had acted outside the authority Zeus held over the conditions of mortal life. And in each case, the tradition held that what followed was not the expression of a particular mood or a particular moment of divine attention, but the working of a system that did not require Zeus's active intervention in every case because it had been built to run on its own logic. The water stood perfectly still around Tantalus's knees. It had been standing still there for the entire duration of the tradition. The fruit hung exactly as heavy as it had always hung. The branches drew back as they had always drawn back, at the same moment, at the same angle, whenever the hand reached up. The punishment was not ongoing because Zeus was watching closely. It was ongoing because that was the shape of it, the form it had settled into, the arrangement that expressed in spatial and temporal terms exactly what Tantalus had done. The tradition did not need to explain it at length. It needed only to describe it, and the description carried its own weight. The eagle of Zeus descended each day toward the Caucasus rock, dropping through the enormous sky above the mountains, its path the same path it had taken every day for longer than the myth cared to count. From a great distance, Prometheus would have been able to watch it coming, a shape above the horizon, growing as it came, the wings moving in the long, unhurried arcs of a bird that has no reason to hurry, that will arrive when it arrives, and return the next day, whether it hurries or not. The rock beneath him did not move. The chain held as chains hold, not with effort, but simply by being what it was. The sky above the Caucasus in the morning was wide and cold and entirely indifferent to the situation it contained. That sky, and the bird descending through it, and the rock that had been there before Prometheus arrived and would be there after he was eventually freed. These images carry something the tradition seems to have found in the concept of divine law at its deepest level. The law was not personal. It did not depend on Zeus being attentive or angry or focused on the specific rock at the specific moment. It had been set in motion, and it ran. The eagle came back because the eagle always came back. The water receded because the water always receded. The valley in Phrygia lay under its lake because the doors had been shut when the doors should have been open, and the consequences of that had unfolded in the only direction consequences can unfold. And somewhere to the east, in the Caucasus, in the cold and the open sky, the eagle was descending again across the vastness of the air, its wings moving in their long, patient arcs, its shadow falling across the mountain, and then across the rock, and then the day beginning in the way the day had always begun in that place, recurring exactly as it was ordained to recur. The whole arrangement neither urgent nor finished, measuring time in the daily return of a single bird across the same wide sky, still and impassive as the mountains beneath it, turning once more toward the rock. Before Zeus swallowed her, Metis was something that existed separately in the world, a mind moving through the world alongside all other minds, her own, complete, the kind of intelligence that did not simply know things, but turned them over, held them at different angles, found what was useful in them, and set aside what was not. The tradition describes her as a Titaness, a figure of the generation before the Olympian gods, and her name in Greek carries the meaning of cunning intelligence, the wisdom that is also craft, the knowledge that understands the shape of what is coming before it arrives. She was not simply wise in the way a book is full of information. She thought the way water moves, finding the low place, getting through. The union between Zeus and Metis had already begun when the prophecy came. Hesiod's Theogony records it plainly, without elaboration, as a warning from the earth and the starry sky, that Metis was destined to bear children of surpassing power, that the first would be Athena, gray-eyed and equal to her father in strength and counsel, and that the second, a son, if the pregnancy had continued, would have become king of gods and mortals, both displacing Zeus, as Zeus had displaced Kronos, and Kronos had displaced Eranos before him. The pattern had its own weight. It had already happened twice. The tradition understood it as something that gathered momentum the longer it ran. What Zeus did next was, even within a tradition not known for ordinary choices, unusual. He swallowed Metis, not destroyed her, swallowed, taken inward, made interior. The distinction matters in Hesiod's telling. Metis was not killed, her wisdom was not extinguished, it was relocated, brought inside the body and mind of the god who had feared what it would produce if allowed to remain outside him, independent, pursuing its own course. Hesiod notes that Zeus acted on the counsel of Gaia and Aranos, the earth and sky, who told him what was coming and suggested they act as the way to prevent the second birth, the one that would have ended his reign before it fully settled. The Theogony describes this swallowing as the moment Metis became part of Zeus. Her knowledge of good and evil, the tradition says, absorbed into him along with everything else she carried. There is a quality to this that is worth sitting with at some length. The act was not the taking of Metis's wisdom in the sense of theft or conquest. She was not an enemy defeated and stripped of her capacities. She was drawn inward, held there. The intelligence she represented folded so completely into Zeus that it became indistinguishable from his own. When Zeus deliberated from that point forward, Metis was part of the deliberation. When he saw the shape of events before they arrived, some portion of that vision came from her. The tradition does not present this as a diminishment of Metis so much as a transformation of what wisdom was, from a figure who walked separately in the world to a principle operating inside the god who governed it. The theogony holds this as the first move in a sequence, the beginning of a pattern Zeus would follow across several great unions, each one installing something that the cosmos still needed. What the swallowing of Metis produced, in Hesiod's account, was Athena, and Athena's birth is one of the stranger images the Greek tradition generated, which is saying something about a tradition whose images run toward the strange as a matter of course. The goddess of wisdom and craft and strategic intelligence came into the world not from a mother's labor, but from Zeus's own head, emerging fully grown, already wearing armor, a war shout on her lips at the moment of her arrival. Hesiod describes the event with a particular kind of brevity that makes it feel almost architectural, as if a wall opened and something that had always been inside stepped through. The smith god Hephaestus, by one version of the story, opened the way with a blow of his axe. By others, the birth simply happened, the skull of the sky god parting to deliver the goddess who embodied the wisdom he had taken in. Athena standing in the world for the first time, armed, clear-eyed, her spear and her aegis already settled around her, is the image the theogony leaves with Hesiod's reader. What preceded her, invisible inside the god who bore her, was Metis herself, the wisdom now so integrated with the rule of the cosmos that it had produced a form that could walk through it, speak through it, act through it. The first of Zeus's great marriages had not simply added a consort. It had installed wisdom as something internal to the order Zeus maintained, made it a constitutive part of the way the world was governed, rather than an independent power that might at some point have moved in a different direction. The second great union the theogony describes was with Themis, whose name carries a meaning older and more structural than law in the way the word is used now, not the particular laws of a particular city, but the underlying order of things, the pattern that was already there before anyone named it, the arrangement of the world as it ought to be. Themis was a titaness as Metis had been, a figure of the generation that preceded the Olympians, and she carried in her nature something that the cosmos required, but had not yet formally organized. Pindar's Pythian odes celebrate her as the first deity invited by the fates to become Zeus's bride, placing her before even Hera in the sequence of divine unions, and in ancient art she appears seated beside Zeus as a counselor present at his deliberations, the one whose presence ensures that what he decides does not simply reflect his own power, but accords with the order the world already contained. From the union with Themis came two groups of daughters, and between them they covered the widest span of what the theogony understood as necessary for the cosmos to function. The first three were the Horae, Eunomia, Dike, and Irene, whose names mean lawfulness, justice, and peace. In the Greek religious understanding, they were not simply abstract principles given names and faces. They were the conditions without which the world could not move through time in any useful direction. Lawfulness was the quality that made agreements hold, and any justice was the quality that ensured consequences followed, actions at the proper proportion. Peace was the state that made both of the others possible to sustain, the ground without which neither law nor justice could take root. Hesiod does not present them as decorative figures standing in the background of Zeus's court. They were the daughters of the god of the sky and the goddess of divine order, and their existence meant that those principles were now woven into the structure of reality in a way they had not been before their births. The second three daughters were the Moirai, the Fates, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, whose names describe the three acts of their work: spinning, measuring, and cutting. The thread they handled was the thread of mortal life, drawn from the spindle at birth, extended through whatever length the Fates determined was appropriate, and severed when the measure was complete. Hesiod's theogony assigns them to the union with Themis, embedding them in the same genealogy as lawfulness and justice and peace, and this arrangement is not incidental. The Fates were the enforcement mechanism of the order their sisters represented. When Eunomia and Dike described what was just and lawful, Atropos and her sisters were the reason that the arrangements of mortal lives ultimately conformed to what had been determined, whether mortals understood it or not. No appeal went past them. No prayer altered what Atropos's shears had already done. The theogony holds them as daughters of Zeus and Themis, which means that the structure of mortal destiny was not something that had always simply existed, unconnected to any divine will. It was produced, shaped, and installed in the cosmos as part of the sequence of acts by which the world was given its architecture. The Moirai working quietly in whatever place they work, Clotho turning the spindle, Lachesis drawing the thread to its measured length with steady hands, Atropos holding the shears level against the thread, preparing to make a cut that cannot be revisited. This is an image that the Greek tradition returned to repeatedly across different genres in different centuries, because it captured something the tradition needed to express about the nature of mortal life. Not dread, exactly. Certainty. The thread ran between their hands with perfect evenness, and its end was already known to them in the way that weavers know, from the weight of the wool on the spindle, how much remains. What the myth installed in the cosmos through the union of Zeus and Themis was not an arbitrary power over mortal lives, but a structured, proportionate principle of completion. Every thread began, every thread ended. The Fates knew the length of each, and their work moved without hurry and without interruption. The third great union in Hesiod's sequence was different in nature from the first two, turned from wisdom and cosmic order towards something softer and more particular. Zeus and Eurynome, daughter of Ocean, came together to produce the Charites, whom the Romans would call the Graces, Aglaia, Euphrosyne, and Thalia, whose names mean brightness, joy, and bloom. The theogony describes them in the same catalog of births that holds the Horae and the Moirai, and their place in that sequence is worth pausing on. After wisdom, after law and fate and justice, the world required something that none of those things alone could provide. It required the quality that makes existence agreeable rather than merely ordered. The Charites in the Greek tradition were not simply goddesses of beauty in the shallow sense. They were the presiding figures of the grace that flowed between people when things were going well, the warmth of a celebration that was genuinely felt rather than merely performed, the loveliness that attended a festival, a gift, a moment of genuine human ease. Their births from Zeus and Eurynome meant that this quality too was formally installed in the architecture of the world, carried by actual divine figures rather than simply arising occasionally when circumstances permitted. The union that followed was with Mnemosyne, whose name is one of the most important in the Greek theogony, even though she is not among the Olympians and does not hold a place in the great court on the mountain. Mnemosyne means memory, not personal memory, the recollection of what happened last year or what was said at dinner, The tradition understood her as the principle by which the past was preserved and transmissible, the capacity of the world to hold what had already occurred, rather than losing it completely as time moved forward. From the 9 nights Zeus and Mnemosyne spent together came 9 daughters, the Mosi, the Muses, whose names and domains would be mapped and remapped across centuries of Greek and later Roman literary tradition, but whose function was established at the moment of their birth. They were the daughters of memory. What they presided over? Song, poetry, history, astronomy, dance, tragedy, comedy, the epic, the lyric, were the forms in which human experience was held and transmitted, passed from one person to the next and from one generation to the following one, so that what had been known was not simply forgotten when the person who had known it died. Hesiod knew this with a specific kind of personal feeling, because the theogony begins with the Muses. Before the theogony reaches Zeus's marriages, before it reaches the origins of the gods, or the making of the world, it opens on the Muses on Mount Helicon, moving there in the early dark, their feet touching the Mount Spring, their song rising as they go. Hesiod describes them as having appeared to him on the slopes of Helicon and having breathed into him the divine voice with which he sang. He understood himself as their instrument. The tradition of which he was a part depended on them, in the same way that any tradition of preserved knowledge depends on memory. They were what made it possible for the old stories to reach anyone at all. Their 9 births from Zeus and Mnemosyne were, in this reading, the moment at which the cosmos acquired the capacity not merely to exist, but to know itself, to hold what it had been, and carry it forward as something still present. Demeter came next, and from the union of Zeus and Demeter came Persephone, and in those 2 births the Greek tradition placed the origin of something that governed mortal life as completely as the fates governed its length. Demeter's domain was the earth's fertility, the grain, the harvest, the annual return of growth from the bare winter ground. Persephone's mythology would take her into the underworld as its queen, and her movement between the upper world and the lower would become the Greek tradition's account of why seasons existed, why the earth went bare in winter and returned to growth in spring. But in the theogony's genealogical structure, those stories follow from the simple fact of the births, that the union of the sky god with the goddess of the grain produced a daughter who would become the organizing principle of the earth's annual cycle. The seasons were not something that simply happened. They had a cause, built into the divine genealogy, traceable to a specific union and the child that came from it. What Hesiod describes across this sequence of unions is not a collection of separate stories. It is a system. Each marriage produced not merely children, but domains, not merely gods and goddesses, but principles without which the cosmos would have been structurally incomplete. Wisdom inside the mind of the ruler, divine order as the framework within which he deliberated, justice, lawfulness, and peace as the conditions of mortal and divine life, the fates as the mechanism that gave mortal life its appointed measure, grace as the quality that made the order livable rather than merely imposed, memory as the faculty that allowed what had been to persist into what would be, the muses as the forms through which memory became transmissible across generations, Persephone and the turning of the seasons as the rhythm that gave the earth its motion through the year. The theogony moves through each birth in the same register, calm, precise, systematic, because the register fits the nature of what is being described. This is not a collection of love affairs, it is the installation of a world. Hera's place in this sequence is both the end of it and a kind of culmination. She is the last of Zeus's great divine unions in Hesiod's theogony, and she is the one whose name carries the title that most completely mirrors his own. Where Zeus was Basileus, king, Hera held the title Basileia, queen, and the pairing was not merely linguistic. Her worship across the Greek world attested to a divine queenship that was active, autonomous, and widely recognized as having real authority over the domains she governed. The Heraion at Argos and the Heraion of Samos are among the oldest monumental temples known to the archaeology of the Greek world. Large stone structures raised in her name at a time when such construction was an enormous commitment of resources and communal effort. The communities that built them understood her importance as equal in kind, if different in nature, to Zeus's own. Hera held the epithet Hera Teleia, Hera of the completed thing, Hera of the fulfilled marriage, the goddess who presided over the formal institution of wedlock in its fully realized form. The word teleia in Greek carried the sense of something brought to its proper conclusion, something that had run its full course and arrived where it was going. Marriage under her authority was not merely the beginning of a union, but the structure of a shared life as it was supposed to be, ordered, recognized, socially embedded, held within the framework of divine sanction. Women in the ancient Greek world who were entering marriage prayed to Hera. Women who wanted children prayed to Hera. The institution of the household as a stable, continuing thing was hers to govern, and the weight of that governance was felt across the entire Greek world, from the smallest island community to the largest mainland city. Homer's Iliad depicts Hera in a way that makes her queenship concrete rather than ceremonial. She speaks in the divine assembly with the expectation that she will be heard. She pursues her own agenda regarding the Trojan War with persistence and intelligence, forming alliances, persuading where she cannot command, and meeting Zeus's opposition with the kind of measured resistance that belongs to a figure who understands the boundaries of a real political relationship rather than performing submission. The Iliad does not present her as a subordinate who occasionally oversteps. It presents her as a queen whose domain of authority is distinct from Zeus's, who challenges what she disagrees with and accepts the limits of her power in the way someone accepts a constraint they have not chosen but recognizes as real. The divine court in Homer is not a place of simple hierarchical obedience. It is a court with the full complexity that word implies, competing interests, maintained alliances, the ongoing negotiation of a power structure that is stable but not static. What Hera's queenship added to the structure Hesiod's sequence had been building was the formal counterpart of Zeus's own authority, not the installation of another principle, as the earlier unions had each installed a principle, but the establishment of a mirroring. The cosmos now had a king and a queen, a ruler of the sky, and a ruler of marriage and completed things, paired figures whose domains were distinct, but whose titles were grammatically and structurally matched. Hera Basileia, beside Zeus, Basileus. The marriage that was itself under her protection was also, in some formal sense, the marriage she herself embodied and represented, the completed union, the thing that had reached its proper form. Hesiod's theological sequence, read from beginning to end, has a shape that becomes visible only when all the unions are laid alongside each other. It begins with the taking in of wisdom, Metis swallowed, her intelligence internalized, and proceeds outward from that center in rings. From wisdom, divine order, from divine order, justice and fate, from the deep reaches of the ocean's daughter, grace, from the oldest faculty of the cosmos, memory, and from memory, the forms in which human experience was preserved. From the grain of the earth, the goddess who would govern the earth's seasons, and from the formal union with the queen, the completed form of the divine household itself. The cosmos that emerged from this sequence was not a place that simply existed. It was a place that had been organized, given its structure by a series of acts that were also, in the deepest sense, the installation of the principles it would run on. The 9 daughters of memory move across the slopes of Helicon in the early morning, and the mountain is still. Their breath is visible in the cold air. The sky above them is the sky that Zeus governs, its light beginning at the horizon in the particular way that light begins when it has been absent all night, and is returning, not sudden, not dramatic, but gradual and certain, the dark giving way to a gray that is not yet color, that will become color slowly at the pace of its own unhurried restoration. The muses do not hurry. What they carry, the forms in which memory becomes song, in which the past becomes present for whoever is listening, is not something that benefits from speed. It moves at the pace of transmission, which is the pace of breath and voice and the long settling of an image in the mind of someone who has heard it. Hesiod stood on the slopes of this mountain and believed they had breathed into him what he would go on to record, and what he recorded has persisted for more than 25 centuries, carried through manuscripts and their copies of copies, across the fall of the civilization that produced it, and the long work of transmission through later traditions that preserved it when the original culture was gone. What the muses gave him was the capacity to hold a story in a form that other minds could receive, and what those other minds received, they passed on in turn, and what arrived at any given moment in the chain of transmission was the same account Hesiod had set down, worn slightly smooth by the journey, still recognizable, still holding the same structure the tradition had always held. The 9 of them move in the cold air on the mountain's upper slopes, their movement unhurried, the day forming around them,